Hello, dear ones, and welcome to music lovers, poetry lovers, and those who love to worship the Lord with music and song. My name is Christopher Watson, and today we're going to look at an amazing, groundbreaking hymn book, the Scottish Psalter. Let's start with a tune. You may recognize that tune, but perhaps let's hear it again with the melody in the top voice. So that tune, which in the Scottish Psalter is called Winchester, these days we call it Winchester Old, but in those days it was just called Winchester because it wasn't old then, began as a psalm tune. These days you'd know it better as a Christmas carol. It appears a little differently in the 1635 Psalter. It was the same melody but in the tenor. That was very common then, and the timing was different. So Winchester Old was written by George Kirkby. He was an Anglican, and it was written for an Anglican psalm book called Thomas Esther's Whole Book of Psalms. It was a popular tune, and it was adopted by the Scottish Psalter editors, and they adapted it by adding the long syllables, which are useful for part singing by lining out, where the parts are sung by a precentor. There are some lovely singable hymn tunes in the Scottish Psalter, especially the later editions, the ones that we're familiar with, and we'll look at them in the future. There's a couple I'd like to look at very soon. For the Scottish Psalter of 1635, Winchester, what we call Winchester Old, with its catchy melody, was very much a hint of things to come. Strong singable tunes like this are a feature of the Scottish Psalter as we have received it, but the early editions were different. The Scottish Psalter of 1635 and the editions before contained a number of other tunes, which were called the common tunes, and in a few places of the early editions these are spelt as tones. These tunes were not to continue in later editions, and yet they represent a brief period of striking musical originality and beauty. Serious music with a serious Protestant spiritual intent. As we understand the Scottish Psalter today, when I first heard about the Scottish Psalter, which was in reference to Isaac Watts, I was told about the metrical psalm tradition, and I had this idea of a tradition as something which had lasted a very long time, a period of little change over a long time, which was not at all the case. In fact, when Isaac Watts began to extend his writing to non-psalms, he was augmenting a musical movement that was still young, dynamic, and innovative. Hymns didn't begin with the Scottish Psalter, and in fact, arguably, the Scottish Psalter is not, in fact, a hymn book, certainly the early versions, in the strictest sense. because there was a distinction in this period between hymns and psalms, and Psalter means a psalm book, and the first editions were all psalms. The early Protestants considered themselves what we would call fundamentalists, in the neutral sense of people returning to the origins of their faith. However, like most so-called fundamentalists, there was actually a lot of innovation in what they did, even a degree of revolutionarity in the forms of worship. Because the Psalms are in the Bible, and they believed in the primacy of Scripture, Psalms were at this time, by this Protestant movement, considered the only proper form of singing to be done in church. However, the translations and paraphrases of the Psalms were poetic and creative, very beautiful in fact. They weren't the first like this, but there was a big increase in the writing of psalms and other spiritual songs from this point on, and a further increase after Isaac Watts, of course, whose writing dates from not long after the Psalter. There's an excellent 19th century reproduction of the 1635 Psalter, produced in 1864, with lovely engravings made of the music, done in 17th century style, but very clearly, much clearer than the original. The editor of this was the Reverend Neil Livingston, and his engraver was William Ewing. The idea of the metrical psalm didn't begin with the Scottish Psalter, but in English, it is the first major publication to promote the concept of hymn texts and metrical tunes as being fully interchangeable. So a hymn text has a certain number of syllables, a metrical tune has a melody that can fit those syllables, and you can match any tune to any psalm and vice versa. All the psalm tunes in the first versions of the Scottish Psalter were in common metre, so 8 syllables, 6 syllables, 8 syllables, 6 syllables. Having said that, it also continued the practice of having specific settings for certain psalms. This metrical quality is what people are referring to when they refer to the metrical psalm tradition. So the metre, just to stress this again, the metre is not a time signature or a musical rhythm, it's the syllable pattern of the text. The wholehearted adoption of independent metrical tunes led rapidly and directly to the metrical indexes of hymn books in the 18th century and beyond. However, it's the common tunes, especially these early common tunes, that I'd like to look at. Before we get to that, another huge effect of the Scottish Psalter was what we might call sociological, the democratization of hymn and tune writing, probably thanks to the fact that these scholars allowed themselves to remain somewhat anonymous. The Reverend Livingston has a list of names associated with certain of the tunes and paraphrases of the psalm texts, but I don't know where he got them. The authorship of the versions we see on hymnary.org, for example, are not listed. So effectively, these tunes today are anonymous. Let's have a little look at the splendid reproduction of the 1635 Psalter. You can find this on both imslp.org and archive.org. Just search for 1635 Scottish Psalter. So there's a lot of notes by the editor, Neil Livingston, at the beginning, and on page 72, as numbered, there are some lovely facsimiles. This kind of quality in 1864 would have been photolithography, which was a new invention then. There are only a few pages, but they're expertly reproduced. They look like good photocopies. You can even see the printing flaws in the original. It was probably expensive then, being a new printing technique. The rest of the music and text has been beautifully retypeset and re-engraved, adhering faithfully to the content, style and format of the original, but with a wider, clearer layout that makes it much more readable. Reverend Livingston did an extraordinary job. In terms of the tunes, I haven't decoded all of these scores yet. These older scores are difficult for someone of my ability, but I've tried out a few, and there are some I really like. If you see among the common tunes, there's one They're called French. That's another name for what we now call Dundee. And interestingly, there's a tune there called Dundee, which is a different tune, which didn't continue into later editions and doesn't feature now in hymn books. So French became our Dundee. A lovely tune. We will look at that fairly soon. There's also a tune called Abbey, now known as Abbey, and Martyrs. These are not especially common now, but are still in hymn books. A few of the others were also retained and exist in hymn books today, but some of the really interesting and unusual ones were removed from the Scottish Psalter shortly after this. They were just a little too weird, I think. Here we have what are called some reports. A report in this period describes the call and response that is still common, although it's usually spoken, not sung, in Protestant churches. In our church, we do this in spoken form, and apparently this was once quite common. I'm not sure the degree to which it's still practiced in different churches, but both Catholic and Protestant churches have done this, and many may still do it. Here in the Psalter, the call and response is sung. They seem to have loved singing. As noted, there are a lot of psalm settings, so psalms with music especially for them. And there's a complete set of psalm texts. But these are different from the ones that we have received as being described as from the Scottish Psalter. Here's Psalm 23. It's not the famous one, famously set to the tune Crimond. The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He maketh me down to lie. In pastures green he leadeth me, the quiet waters by. That's from a later version of the Scottish Psalter. Here it is, the Lord is only my support, and he that doth me feed. This is a psalm text I'll look at again in the future. Here's Psalm 46. In the 1635 Psalter, it's the Lord is our defence and aid, the strength whereby we stand. Whereas the version that we know begins, God is our refuge and our strength, in straits a present aid. And here's the famous Psalm 121. It's not yet the text we know, unto the hills I lift mine eyes, but begins, I lift mine eyes to Sion hill. And here's Psalm 130. Lord, from the depths to thee I cried. And here it is, Lord, to thee I make my moan when dangers me oppress. So they're all a little bit different. The common tunes were used in worship a little bit like Taizé, if you know what Taizé is. If you haven't heard of Taizé, it's a modern Christian form of worship and meditation music. These are easy to find online. Taizé chants are recent and modern, and they're probably all under copyright, so I won't show any of them. You can find them yourself. Taizés are short and chant-like, but they're not based directly on plain chant. In the earlier versions of the Scottish Psalter, there's an earlier, completely original, more complex, and I would say more profound form of meditation music. This concept of prayerful meditation in song to focus the mind and take you out of your daily thought space is very powerful and common across denominations and across cultures. Let's have a look at the notation of one of these pieces. I'll show you Galloway, which is one of my favorites. So you can see it has a simple key signature. All of the pieces in this Psalter of 1635 are written in F, which implies that they were using relative pitch. It's unmeasured, so the bar lines mark phrases. They don't mark measures or bars of specific number of beats. They have clefs. They've got the C clef and the F clef, but the treble clef wasn't in use then. In these tones or common tunes, there's no strong rhythm. It's based on syllables, like plain chant. The tenor is often the melody, but there's no single leading melody. It's a woven whole, like polyphony. However, it also has a fairly strong chordal style. This type of chordal music was a Baroque innovation at this time. The overall effect is strikingly original. These are new ideas, original meditative worship music for congregations, basically meditation music for choirs. There's also historical accounts that there was a lot of embellishment that took place with these tunes. There are some reports that this occurred in Catholic choral singing. It was certainly occasionally practiced in medieval polyphony, and you can definitely hear it today in churches that provide spirit-led styles of worship. So this is basically a semi-improvised form of music. You might call it extemporization rather than improvisation, because it's improvisation within a fairly strong structure. And this has come from the Scottish Church through American churches, including African American churches, into churches today. So these pieces, the common tunes, or sometimes called tones, are harmonic outlines that provide a structure for ecstatic, spontaneous, extemporized expression. So people putting their own feeling, adding in their own expressions to God. This is a very different style of music from anything else in the hymn tradition at this time, and I find it very exciting. So these unusual tunes, combined with the singing style, which persists today, some people hated it and continue to hate it, and some people love it. Historian Michael Crawford describes criticisms of the time. He says congregations sang in the nasal, reedy voice of Scottish folk singing, without regular pulse or rhythm, and embroidered the tunes with improvised melodic decorations. Different parts of the congregation would sing at varying tempos, while some individuals chose a tune different from the set one. Despite the anarchic cacophony, many pious Scots found this form of worship spiritually edifying. Other people loved it. Francis Wilkins, who studied it in our time, calls it a heterophonic soundscape. This kind of music is often referred to as modal. In music theory, that term gets applied to anything that isn't strongly major or minor. It's probably a fair label. At this time, modal music would have been part of the shared cultural memory of the community. It doesn't have strong cadences. It's not using chords in a structural way to give a sense of movement to the melody. The common tunes, as they're called, use the chord colours, but there's a floating quality to them, not strongly directed, which later theorists might associate with the term modal. I don't want to say aimless because that's negative and it misses the point. The term modal is rather broadly applied and misses the specifics, especially of music like this, which has unique qualities of its own, making it different from later medieval and other music that fit more neatly under the label modal. The lack of strong structural chord changes and the corresponding strong rhythms they produce is deliberate. It's intended for a purpose. This is spiritual music, so a floating quality is entirely appropriate, and to my ears it gives them a mysterious beauty. The use of these early common tunes with embellishments are similar to contemporary music styles that feature improvisation or extemporization based on a harmonic framework. You get this in jazz a lot, where the melody and chords can be called a head, and musicians will play freely based on the head, usually within the harmonic framework or the chord pattern, sometimes moving beyond this to something approaching the idea of improvisation as spontaneous composition. Also, the concept of slow meditative music intended to produce an overall feeling is also something that has become popular in a niche sort of way in our time. You may hear this called ambient music, although, as you might guess from that term, it isn't generally as musically engaging as these common tunes from the Scottish Psalter. The deeply spiritual Scottish people were doing the same thing in their communities in both respects, as a form of worship hundreds of years ago. So let's look at some of these pieces. This is what they look like in their original form. So they don't talk about soprano, they talk about treble. And you can see the church part, tenor. This is meant to be the melody, but in fact, it is like polyphony. All the voices fit together to produce a single whole. I've transcribed these using Muse score. So this one has a lovely minor feel. The original is in F, but I've put it into D because I prefer that. In fact, the original for all of them was F. So it's very slow. You see these long syllables, beginning and end of the lines, are to help the congregation begin and end together. The theory is that there would have been a lot of improvisation taking place over these slow notes. It has a somewhat medieval feeling, this one. This is Elgin. I use MuseScore to type up my scores. MuseScore always requires at least one time signature. But if you don't want elements to show up, you can always hide them. In these pieces, sometimes each bar or measure needs its own time signature. Historically, like much music before and after this period, the pieces were unmeasured. To reproduce something with the same bar lines as the original scores required some interesting time signatures. Here it needed 8, 9, 10 and 12 over 2. I wouldn't read too much into these unusual time signatures because firstly, this is soft, floating music without a strong beat. Secondly, much music at this time was similar. It was common for polyphonic compositions, for example, to have passages that in modern notation require the inclusion of longer bars, half bars, or bar lengths that might seem peculiar. I feel this actually says something about our time and the slavish adherence we have to tight little time signatures. In the past, music was much freer. The term rubato in music means robbed, as in the idea that one note robs time from another note. Essentially, it indicates that the performer should feel free to extend or decrease the duration of a note freely. All music should have an element of this. The opposite would be to play metronomically with each note duration exactly as written, which is mechanical and ugly. These common tunes are meant to be sung in a slow rhythm influenced by the syllables of the text. So they should be played as both molto rubato, with much rubato, and sempre rubato, continuously rubato. Some other things to note. The chord names I use are all essentially modern. Names like D minor over F, add nines and so on are all contemporary names for chords. None of these chord names existed before the early jazz era, but I find them useful and instructive. For someone familiar with modern chord theory, you can see what's happening in a piece by looking at the chords, especially when there's some detail there. One thing to note in these pieces is the use of both major and minor forms of common chords at the same time. For example, a major chord is often used to mark the end of a phrase in a piece that's otherwise minor. This is something you hear in modal music. It emphasizes the tonal center of the mode, remembering that modes are scales that are not major or minor. This is very much associated with Renaissance polyphony. It sounds medieval, but it isn't. They didn't do this in the actual medieval period. And it's certainly not something you find in most of the hymn era. While you're quite likely to see a major chord like a dominant seventh, the fifth, resolving to a tonic minor, tonic is the first, which none of the tunes here do, playing the tonic in a minor key as major to mark the end of a phrase was not common after the early Baroque. Another interesting feature is the use of dissonances, especially interesting ones like add nines, as we call them. Add ninths are a lovely, poignant chord, and you find them in music of all eras, Renaissance, Baroque, classical, all the way to modern pop music. They're one of the enduringly popular dissonances. The ninth is, in a sense, a fifth stacked on top of a fifth, which, depending how they interact with the third of the chord, can make them sound sweet and yet spacious in a way. This is Elgin. The D sharps produce B major chords because D sharp is the third of B major. And so they put this tune into E minor because B major is the fifth of E, and that resolution from B major to E minor produces a tonal center that puts you into E. So the B major to the E minor resolves to the E minor. My version has been transposed from F to D. All of these tunes are scored in F, but it isn't in D major or B minor. D's relative minor. It was probably conceived as being in the E Dorian mode, but it's an unusual piece with a somewhat nebulous sense of key. This is Irving. It's an interesting piece. It has some dissonance in here, the E over the F, and the lovely change to major at the end of each line. Very interesting. Here's Irving, which is notable for some lovely dissonances, and also uses D major as a closing chord for phrase 1 and at the end of the piece. This is pretty, and as mentioned, has strong hints of the techniques of the polyphonic composers. Ending passages on major chords and minor keys or in modal pieces to emphasize the key area. This is my favorite. This is Galloway. Again, the original is in F, but I've changed it to G. This here is quite a dissonant chord. So it's got a G and an F sharp together. That dissonance is in the original. It's not a playing mistake. Quite charming, actually. You can imagine that there would be quite a lot of those interesting dissonances arising from the extemporized singing, which was something that happens in polyphony too, where you get the dissonances that then resolve. With these overlapping sounds, you're getting chords which in contemporary music we would find quite jazzy, in fact. And this is Galloway. There's something about Galloway I really like. It wanders harmonically in a very gentle, airy way, although it is in the key as written. In this case, I've transposed it from F to G, so it's in G. And it also includes some very nice dissonances. Here, the B natural over the C in the bass is a major seventh, which is sweet, but still a dissonance of sorts. The major seventh is the sweetest of all dissonances. The third phrase has a lovely dissonance, and I had trouble naming this chord. What do you call a chord that has a third, a fourth, and a fifth in it? It might be called a cluster chord, except that the notes aren't actually clustered together. A dissonance like that could easily sound horrible, but it appears and then resolves quickly, like the faint shadow of a remembered sorrow, crossing the mind in a moment of contemplation. I also think that these dissonances hint at the effect of the embellishments that the singers used to add. Group improvisation naturally causes harmonic tensions like that. This is part of the beauty of that effect, and also another reason for long syllables at the beginnings and ends of lines, to give a place for the tensions and dissonances to resolve as everyone settles on the final note. I've called C, the C chord, on the fourth beat of the last phrase C2. It's really an interesting chord, and another one I like. A C with a ninth added, that's D. Typically when you call a chord a ninth, you're implying that the major third is in it, but if it's just the tonic, the fifth, and the ninth, I'd call that a C2, so you make a distinction between the two. Anyway, it's really an interesting chord, and it's another chord I really like. A C with an added ninth, and if you imagine all the extemporized singing and the embellishments going on, giving you probably other notes from the C chord would probably come out as a lovely, rich C add 9. I've played a rather rough improvisation of what I think this kind of thing might sound like. I mean, you really need a group of voices who are spiritually inspired to do it properly, but I've improvised using this harmonic pattern as a basis and improvising on the guitar to see what it might sound like.
give an attentive ear. Lord, who shall stand if thou, O Lord, shouldst mark iniquity, but yet with thee forgiveness is, that fear thou mayest be. I wait for God, my soul doth wait. My hope is in the Lord, more than they that for morning watch. My soul waits for the Lord. That's a strange and beautiful hymn. Praise be to God.